Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Israelcast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and on this episode, our featured guest is Izabella Tabarovsky. Now, Izabella, who grew up in the USSR and emigrated to the US in 1989 at age 19, is today a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism. She's a senior fellow at the Z3 Institute for Jewish Priorities and fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Comper Center for the Study of Antisemitism and Racism at Haifa University, and the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. Her writings appear far and wide, and in fact, she just released her very first book, which is fantastic. You see it right here. If you're joining us via YouTube, it's titled Be a Refusenik, a Jewish Student's Survival Guide. It's published by Wicked Sun Press, and I urge you to pick up a copy wherever you like to buy your books. And with all that Izabella has done, perhaps her greatest career highlight is that she was a previous guest here on Israelcast back in November of 2021. And with that, we warmly welcome Izabella Tabarovsky back to Israelcast, who joins us now on the line via Zoom from her Jerusalem home. Izabella, so great to see you again, and thanks so much for joining us. And gotta say, wasn't Israelcast your crowning achievement so far in your career?
It really was. I'm so glad you mentioned it. It's wonderful to be back. Thank you for having me again.
All right. I can't wait to dive into your very important book. But before we do that, I just want to remind all of our dear viewers and listeners that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and helping our brothers and sisters in need following the heinous October 7th terrorist attack. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Plus, if you haven't done so already, we'd absolutely love it if you subscribe, rated, and reviewed us. 5 stars, of course. Wherever you get your podcast, just search for Israelcast. And we'd love it, too, if you shared the show within your orbit. All right, let's bring back our guest, Izabella Tabarovsky. Now, once again, Izabella, congrats on the book. I think everyone should read it. And really, the title, again, Be a Refusenik, a Jewish Student's Survival Guide. And when I was going through the book, I thought to myself that the book is not just for students. It's one part survival guide, yes, indeed, for students, but it's also one part history lesson and one part really a snapshot of our current moment in time. And it's also one part inspiration for folks like yours truly who are in this space right now trying to fight anti-Semitism and to fight anti-Zionism. And so really just once again, congratulations on the book. I know it was probably a labor of love for you because it was very personal because of course you grew up in the Soviet Union.
Well, that's right. And, of course, I've written about the Refuseniks over the years and have thought about Soviet experience in the conditions of anti-Zionist propaganda specifically. And that's what originally made me think that why this story is so relevant for the contemporary moment in America.
Yeah, indeed. And really, before we really dive into the conversation, into the book, would you just set the stage, really, what it was like growing up as a Jew in the Soviet Union to remind those that have perhaps heard the story or those that just really aren't familiar with really what it was like then?
Sure. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s. I was born in 1970. And I always say that I'm not embarrassed to say the year I was born because I want people to understand, to place me correctly in this time period. So I think a lot of times when people know about Soviet anti-Semitism, they know about Stalin's anti-Semitism and they understand kind of what happened to Jews in the late 1940s after the war. But I realized that few people really understood what it was like to be a Jew in the 1970s and the 1980s before the perestroika. Because on the one hand, it was like you always knew that you were a Jew. You was always aware of it, especially if you had features that identified you as Jewish, which in the Slavic culture typically means Mediterranean features. In America, people would never recognize me as Jewish. And in fact, when I talk about it, people say, well, what does a Jew look like? They're surprised to hear that somebody can be identified as a Jew by their look. But in the Soviet Union, in that culture, you always it was for most Jews could be identified as Jews. Also, if you had a Jewish name or an unusual name, people would immediately think, well, okay, this must be a Jewish person. And then, of course, it was also marked in your passport, in your internal documents. Now, to be clear, everybody's ethnicity, which there was called nationality, was marked in the passports. But it was really only for Jews that marker meant discrimination, that you would be discriminated against.
And at school, don't forget.
Well, starting with schools, I mean, at schools, what's interesting, and I write about it in the book, is that at schools, I didn't experience this because my school had a lot of Jewish children. But we lived in the scientific enclave. There were a lot of children of Jewish scientists. But for Jewish children who were in Soviet schools where there weren't a lot of Jews, this was one of the, call it a rite of passage, and for some it was really a moment when they suddenly realized that there was something wrong with their being Jewish. Some really only learned that they were Jewish from this one experience that I'm going to talk about, which is when they come to school at first, in the first grade, and in many times the list of students also marks their ethnicity. And so the teacher might read it out as it takes attendance, or children might just crowd around their desk and look at the list of all the students. And suddenly it turns out that that one person there is a Jew, and that creates a really, you could call it unhealthy curiosity, sometimes laughter, sometimes mocking immediately, sometimes insults. And so this was one of the experiences that Soviet Jewish children often experienced right away. Many became aware of their Jewishness from being teased in the streets. And again, it's important to understand these are not children who are wearing kippot and tzitzit. It's only, they are Russian for all intents and purposes, right? Obviously, they speak Russian. They go on to learn Russian literature and Russian music, etc. But for this, they realize at that early age that they're different from everybody around them. And they're trying to understand what is different about them. And this is where I tell the story of how, actually, I don't remember if it's in the book. I told the story in one of the articles that I wrote for Sapir, where growing up, I could tell you, I could probably reproduce or talk about the national costumes and national ethnic foods and traditions of Georgia and Tajikistan and Ukraine and Belarus. But I could never tell you what did it mean to be, did Jews have special foods? Did Jews have special songs, special music, special attachments, special history? I couldn't have told you. So I knew that I was Jewish, but I never even thought about what did it really mean. Now, this would have been different depending on where you were born. I was born in Siberia, highly, like completely assimilated Jews who, again, were aware of their Jewishness. And you became, I would say, even more aware of your Jewishness as you progressed and wanted to get into a university. And if it was a university that didn't take Jews, or if you wanted to take a career path that was close to Jews, then you really became aware of your Jewishness. Now, for some Jews who lived in the areas of the former Pale of Settlement in Ukraine, in the Baltics, they a lot of times preserved more of the Jewish consciousness that had content, that had Jewish content. They lived close to Holocaust graves. They maybe still had relatives who spoke Yiddish. They maybe had some, these were formerly very religious areas. So maybe their grandfather had a Siddur, or some old book with weird, writing, like in Hebrew. So it varied. Jews in the USSR were varied, and I try to represent it in the book. There, I talk about Georgian Jews and others, and Jews from the Baltics. But this was largely my experience. I had a problem getting into a school that I wanted to get into. I was specifically told, don't try these universities or these colleges. They don't take Jews there. Go here, they take you there. And even then I had an issue. So this was really the experience.
And then talk about how before we talk about the Refuseniks, but talk then about how the Soviet regime really built these ideologies in these programs to target Jews, when that started, and then how that metastasized and how the current generation really inherited that language.
Well, that's a really long story,
Okay.
but
We
I'll
have
try
time, Izabella.
well, usually I cover in a couple of hours in a
Mhm.
lecture, in a couple
Right.
hours
Well,
lecture.
it's actually in the book. So I want people to get the book
Right, right.
also to be
Yes.
able to really read it and truly, truly absorb it. But if you can give us sort of 30,000 feet there.
Yeah. So the kind of the anti-Semitism, the environment that I lived under in the 70s and 80s was heavily influenced and really shaped, not even influenced, but shaped not just by grassroots anti-Semitism that's largely always there in that culture, but by the ideology, the anti-Zionism that became really prominent after starting with 1967 with the Six-Day War, when Israel defeats Soviet Arab allies in the Six-Day War, and the Soviets, for a number of reasons, come to the conclusion that Zionism is now a really dangerous ideology that's operating worldwide, that needs to be defeated, that's allied with its biggest Cold War enemy, the United States. And it's also connected to the fact that after 67, and we're going to get into it, but the Jewish national movement also begins in the USSR, the Refuseniks. So the Soviets view it as both, they view Zionism, they ascribe all kinds of things to Zionists. It's a fully conspiratorial perspective that's completely out of proportion with how many Zionists there are in the world and how big Israel is. They really believe that there is, very much like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, believe that this tiny group of people called Jews manipulates the entire world. The Soviets think that Zionists control and everything. And so, and all of their, all the kind of problems that they encounter internationally and also internally are essentially a product of Zionist manipulation. And so that, they begin a massive campaign. It's an international campaign that is also, of course, first and foremost, it's targeted internally, and it's also spread externally. They target the Western left. They target what was then known the Third World, to inculcate them with this ideology, to join them in this echo chamber that they really built already as part of fighting the United States, shaping a kind of a public opinion in the West that's against America, against the West, and also against Israel and Zionism as part of it. And so that's what really shapes that environment that I grew up in.
Right. And just definitionally, he wants to say, for those people that don't even know what Zionism is, it's really the right for the Jewish people to self-determine in our ancient homeland, full stop at the end. Right. It doesn't mean that there can't be two states, doesn't mean anything else. It's just that's what it means. I just wanted to share that. And really, at its core, it was about, certainly there was an anti-Zionist movement, an anti-Semitic movement prior to 1967 in the Soviet Union. Since the days of the Bolsheviks, Stalin, and so on, and we can get into that if we have time. Yet, post 67, what I'm hearing from you is that this was very much a Cold War tactic on the part of the Soviets to get at the West and to get at the United States.
Correct. And in general, yes, you're absolutely right that the Soviets, as socialists and internationalists, the Bolsheviks are kind of ideologically, they are in general against all nationalisms, and Zionism is a Jewish nationalism, so they're against it. But the quality, so the Soviets were always anti-Zionist, but the quality of their anti-Zionism shifts over time. And I sort of notionally divide it into three periods. It's very notional, but I think the early Bolshevik anti-Zionism is different from late Stalin's anti-Zionism, the post-war Stalin's anti-Zionism, and it's also different from the post-1967 anti-Zionism. I think the post-67 anti-Zionism borrows a lot from late Stalin's period, but it also develops a whole new set of features, and the main of which is that it goes international. During Stalin's time, the anti-Zionist propaganda and repression are largely targeted internally. Some of it spills into Czechoslovakia, but after 67, it really goes global. And it really truly becomes wildly conspiracist.
Right. And then this is a good time also to highlight once again that language that they created back post 1967, that Zionism is racism, it's apartheid, it's genocidal, it's colonial, and all the other names that they like to throw out. All of that metastasized and has been inherited, as you point out in the book, by what we're hearing on campus today and what we hear and see on the streets.
Well, that's right. And to be clear, because a lot of times people ask me fairly, they say, well, the USSR is not there anymore, hasn't been there for 30 years. How does it appear on our campuses suddenly? And, first of all, I tell people, look, the Nazis haven't been around for 80 years, and yet Nazi ideology is still influential. But also, if you read some of the historians already during in the early 70s, essentially they say that by 1973, the Western far left, the socialists, the Trotskyists, the left is very varied, but that's even the new left. They have already adopted this language. They're already speaking about Zionism as Nazism, racism, fascism, etc. All of the things that you named, essentially equating Israel and Zionism with all of humanity's evils, in the same way that the Protocols of Elders of Zion and right-wing anti-Semitism equate Jews with all of humanity's evils.
Right. All right. Now, the title of the book, Be a Refusenik. So, Izabella, for those that don't know what a Refusenik is, explain.
Sure. So the term Refusenik appeared when Soviet Jews began to apply to emigrate. And this happens largely, a mass movement for emigration begins again after 1967. The Six-Day War and Israel's victory is a real turning point for everyone, for all kinds of, for people and entities and agencies. And for Soviet Jews, it's really it marks an explosion of pride. They suddenly become aware that, wow, there is this Jewish country out there that's that's doing this great amazing things, and suddenly they realize that being Jewish doesn't have to be associated with shame, that actually there are Jews who are doing amazing things out there, and they begin to apply to emigrate. There is this resurgence, incredible resurgence of Jewish identity. And I think for people who don't understand it, I just want to emphasize how incredible it is, because by 1967, there is very little that's left of real kind of particular Jewish identity in the USSR. Yiddish is essentially extinguished. There's just one Yiddish magazine left. There is that Jewish autonomous region, Birobidzhan, which never really got populated by Jews and is essentially used as propaganda. So, the Jewish intelligentsia, the last remnants of Yiddish intelligentsia were exterminated under Stalin. So, so there's really very little left. The Holocaust is also essentially silenced. For Jewish identity to suddenly come front and center for Soviet Jews is a really, really big deal. It's really, we know that for American Jews, the Six-Day War also became a real, marked a resurgence of Jewish pride. I know quite a number of American Jews who made Aliyah at that time. But for Soviet Jews, it's different. I mean, it comes really in the complete desert in terms of their identity. So they begin to apply to emigrate, and they are refused. They apply for exit visas and they are refused. And this is, I want to also emphasize, because I've realized there's some things I take for granted, and I forget that people truly don't know a whole lot about the Soviet Union. They don't realize that you couldn't emigrate from the Soviet Union. This was, the country was so great and so proud of itself. It really didn't want people to leave. So they get denied, they get refused the exit visas, and so they're called Refuseniks. There's a word in Russian, but in English they begin to be called Refuseniks.
What's the word in Russian, by the way?
Отказник. Отказник, it's the same kind of, it comes from the same root, of refusal. And it's important to understand also that if you apply to emigrate from the Soviet Union, you were marked essentially as a traitor. And so from that moment on, you, first of all, to even apply for an exit visa, you had to collect documents from everywhere you belonged. So essentially, you couldn't do it quietly. You had to tell everyone in your life, your boss, your university, if you're in school, the party organization that you may have been a part of, the Komsomol organization, if you would say young youth organization, the communist youth organization, and also your parents who might be against, and other members of your family. So you had to get agreements essentially from all of them that, they agree to allow you to leave the country. But that moment then marks you as a traitor. And so you lose your job, or you get kicked out of the university, you get kicked out of all the organizations, and you're really marginalized. So, becoming a Refusenik meant a real change in status. And for a lot of people, it meant losing really excellent careers. The people I describe in the book, they were scientists a lot of times. So it's like they lose everything. Really, they're completely pushed to the margins. They're excluded from everything, and from here, really, the story begins. The story that I tell in the book.
Yeah, and you point out that the term Refusenik is, as you just described, yet it also has another meaning, that these individuals refuse to live within the system that they were living in already.
Well, that's right. So a number of Refuseniks have told me, especially those who were so from here, I should say that my book, there were many Refuseniks. All you had to do to be called a Refusenik was to be refused an exit visa. From there, the paths diverged. Some people, when they were refused, they just stayed quiet. But some people decided to become activists. And so they became Refusenik activists. And so this is who my book is about. So from now on, when I use this term, I talk about them. And so gradually they realized very quickly that, they didn't want to just kind of disappear into the dark and not know what to do. Or disappear into the dark and sort of vanish from the radar, right? And give up on their dream. They wanted to fight for the right to emigrate. But another thing happens to them as well, because they can't leave and they are kicked out of their jobs. So what are they going to do? They decide that they're actually going to use this time, all the time that they have and all the brains that they have, they're going to dedicate them to exploring what does it actually mean to be a Jew? Because again, they really don't know. So they begin to organize and they begin to form groups that begin to teach each other, explore, study together. What does it mean to be a Jew? What is Zionism? What is Israel about? What is Israel's history? What is Jewish history? What is Judaism? And they really, in the book, I use the term crowdsource. They crowdsource their knowledge, because they all have different access to materials. They each bring something. Some of them know some old guy, old religious guy who's hiding somewhere, so they go to him and they learn something from him. They travel to the Holocaust sites, for example, or places of former shtetls in Ukraine, and they study something and they come back and report to others about this. So they become Refuseniks in another sense. And this is, so going back to your question, the leaders of this movement especially begin to think of themselves as people who actually, it's not that they were victims of the state, they refused the position of a victim decisively, rejected it. So they thought of themselves as people who refused essentially to live under the conditions that were proposed to them. They refused the bargain that the state offered them, which is, assimilate, forget about this whole Jewish identity stuff, forget about Jewish particularism, be like everybody else, and then you'll be fine. But of course, they weren't fine anyway. But whatever, this was the bargain, So, and they ultimately refused the system as well. But first and foremost, they refuse this anti-Semitic environment that they are being asked to live in and to assimilate into.
Izabella, I love how you structured the book because, and by the way, we should share with our listeners and viewers that all of what we have spoken about thus far is in the book and more,
Right.
plus. Okay, just saying.
Yes.
I love how you structure the book because each chapter is a different theme. and you have paired up a Refusenik with a student, a young person today
Yeah.
who has been on the front lines. And so before we get into each one of those themes and some of these people, draw the parallels, if you would, between the Refuseniks and Jewish students on campus today.
Sure. So this is a parallel that surprises people, but I've been drawing it now for a number of years in my articles, because what is similar between, obviously, and I say it also in the book, that I'm not saying that today's United States is the same as Brezhnev's USSR. Of course not. You know, there is a limit to every historical analogy, and we have to be clear about it. But what's similar is, you know, there are echoes of the same kind of marginalization and erasure that the Soviet Jews experienced. So I've already talked about how the Refuseniks were marginalized. So if you demanded a right essentially to be Zionist, right? Zionist in the sense that you are interested, you identify with Israel, you identify with it, you identify with the Jewish people, because the Soviets really rejected the idea that Jews were a people. But you are saying, as the Refuseniks did, we are part of the Jewish people and we want to go home and rejoin our people. You know, that you are marginalized and pushed outside organizations and groups, and often your career path is also can be blocked, and your academic path can be blocked. So that already, I think, there is a very strong echo, right? It echoes with what we're seeing today. You know, granted, today's students are not going to find themselves in the gulag. Okay, grant that, absolutely, 100%. But, you know, but within the system of sort of rewards and punishments, students who identify themselves as Zionists actually face pretty severe punishment, to the extent that the American society, progressive society, punishes people. Again, it's exclusion, it's marginalization, etc., and demonization, of course, also. So, you know, so I've been talking about it for a long time, that once Jews start to experience a reality which demonizes Zionists, anti-Semitic outcomes are inevitable. And I began saying it years ago, and now we see it so clearly. I think very few people were, or only some people were, willing to understand me and hear me and believe me. But today, I think it's pretty clear. So this is one of the similarities. You know, when I talk to young students, I realized also that they, or young activists, they're not all students today, but, you know, the young activists in America today, I realized that they have chosen a response to this anti-Zionist reality that structurally is actually reminiscent of what the Refusenik activists in the 1970s and 80s did. One of them is the decision to actually make their Jewish identity a priority. It's actually a structural kind of decision that I think is pretty critical. When the entire society tells you, or everybody around you, everybody that you know, your entire community of people who consider themselves good people, tell you that Zionists are evil, it's not at all obvious for you. It's not an obvious choice for you to actually say, you know what? I don't go with this. I refuse to follow this. I know it would be much easier for me, right? I could just be silent, right? I don't have to fight this. I could just be silent. They don't have to know anything about me. And you go with it. But they choose something very different, just like the Refuseniks did. They actually reclaim their Zionism. And I think this is my first chapter, because I think it's so important. And in that chapter, I talk about you know, the contemporary example that I use is Lisha Baker, a student of Columbia University, who co-writes that letter that really made headlines, In Our Name, which was signed by, I think, close to 800 Columbia Jewish students, where they reclaim their Zionism. So that's an example. I think also the students also realize that they have to organize, and they have to get strategic, and they have to find allies, other people who will fight with them. So this is also similar to how Refuseniks faced it, or how Refuseniks chose to act. So these are just some of the examples.
Sure. And so you've actually ticked off two of the chapters already. One is Reclaim Your Zionism. You paired up Lishi Baker with Boris Kojubievsky.
Right.
And his story was actually quite remarkable. And if in just really, really briefly, you just want to share his story.
Sure. So Boris Kochubievsky was one of the very early Refuseniks. I think that Americans, members of the American movement for Soviet Jewry, actually, I think, call him the first. So the movement for Soviet Jewry by 1967-68 already existed, but what it needed was example specific people that they could rally around. They didn't want to just talk about, abstractly about Soviet anti-Semitism. They wanted specific people. And I believe that Kochubievsky was the first person that appeared on their radar. He began, he went against the Soviet state very, very early on. So after 1967, after the Six-Day War, there were rallies all over the USSR, mandated from above, obviously. People were ordered, workplaces were ordered to get people together for political information lectures, as it was known then, to condemn Israel, to condemn Zionism. And it was done in order for the Soviet press to say that we are, the people from all over the country unanimously condemn Israel and Zionism. Now, you could say, why did they have to do it? Soviet propaganda could just say anything it wanted, but they wanted specific examples, and so this was done all around the country. And Kochubievsky worked at a radio factory in Kiev, and he refused to just sit quietly there. You see, like these points of these moments of choice, I think actually are the strongest sort of examples for us to investigate, because this is something that we face today as well. In fact, I just heard recently an American Jew told me that he also was sitting in some kind of a meeting at work where they were condemning Zionism, and he raised his hand and he said, "I disagree." This is exactly what Kochubievsky did in 1967. It's much harder to do than people may imagine. But maybe today people actually do understand how hard it is to do. So from there begins a whole story of persecution. Everybody is horrified at the factory. The management is horrified. How can he, we are supposed to be unanimous. It's really important for us to be unanimous in our condemnation of Zionism in Israel. And they kind of tried to push him to quit his job. And he resisted for a while. And then eventually he does quit his job. And the very next day he goes and applies to emigrate to Israel. And then there is this crazy trial, totally just a Kafkaesque, horribly anti-Semitic trial that he's put through in Kiev. Then he spends, I think, 2 or 3 years in the Gulag, and then finally they release him, and he goes to Israel. But yeah, this is a story that I think is very relatable in the current moment.
And he became the face, really, of the movement, didn't he, at the very beginning? And one of the interesting things you point out in the book is that how communities in the diaspora galvanized around this whole Save Soviet Jewry moment and movement, yes. And it gave strength and a sense of pride and renewal to Jewish communities, yes. Throughout the world. And I draw that parallel to after October 7th, right? You have the October 8th Jew.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. Natan Sharansky, who wrote the introduction, the foreword.
And we'll be getting to him.
We'll get to him, but he writes specifically. So I focus on the Soviet story of the Refuseniks. He writes about, and the reason I thought about it is that he also compares the Soviet Jewry movement, the movement for Soviet Jews that forms in America and the UK and elsewhere, and compares that to the current moment, the post-October 7th moment. What is similar? What is different? What can we learn from that movement to really mobilize better in our fight against what we're facing?
Right. And, personally, I take great pride in Israel and in Zionism post October 7th, really. And I draw strength from the stories of the hostages as well. And I think, as you point out in the book, somebody pointed out in the book, is this notion that Jews in the diaspora said, if Jews in the Soviet Union can keep Shabbat to the extent that they do, if they embrace Jewish practices under those conditions, certainly I can do it.
Yes.
And I look at those hostages and I think to myself, holy smokes. I mean, if they can, well, of course I fast anyway on Yom Kippur and, the other fast days, but I think to myself during the fast, can you imagine fasting as a hostage, as some did, right?
Yes.
Having
Yes.
no food whatsoever, or trying to keep some semblance of Shabbat, making Kiddush, saying Hamotzi, the prayer over the bread, right?
Right.
To the
Exactly.
extent that they could. There's no reason why we who live in a free society can't do that. So I think we all truly can draw great inspiration from those hostages that went through beyond hell, and
Well,
are
and
here
and
to give us that inspiration.
yes, totally. And actually, I think this is also one of the thoughts that I tried to communicate in the book
Yeah,
is, if Soviet, if Refusenik activists, if the Refuseniks were able to stand up, what they stood up for too was in many ways so much bigger, so much scarier, right? An entire apparatus of a massive, authoritarian state with the KGB that was present everywhere, the fearlessness with which they acted in defying that state and its rules. I think in a way, I think it can help us because I know that today a lot of American Jews, the American Jewish community is very, it's a very difficult moment. It's confused, it's scared, it doesn't know what to do. And I think that, again, if Jews back then could stand up against a machinery, a totalitarian machinery, essentially, that spewed anti-Zionist libels, then certainly we can do it in America today.
indeed. All right. So going back to the chapters, we've already covered Reclaim Your Zionism. And then also the other one that you highlighted is Find Your Comrade in Arms. You had Alexander Smuckler and then A.L. Jacobi
Yes.
featured in that. And you hinted at it, but is there anything in general that you want to say about the importance of finding your comrades in arms? In other words, the importance of your tribe, of a group of people that you can rely on. Because when I was reading that chapter, I thought to myself, and other points in the book, I thought to myself, these people were really brave because, here we have social media today. You can say anything you want. You can, find like-minded people, but to be able to find like-minded people in
Yeah.
such a repressive society was really an astonishing feat.
Well, it was probably not too hard for them to find each other back then, but
Well,
what's
certainly
really
was
important,
scary, Izabella,
it was scary. That's
and
exactly
dangerous.
right. That's right. So, one of the refuseniks that I quote there, it's in a different chapter. It's about the Leningrad hijacking, the airplane hijacking. So, Eduard Kuznetsov, really one of the greatest figures in the Soviet dissident movement, who passed away, I think, a couple of years ago here in Israel. He spent a lot of time behind bars, like I think on 2 or 3 different occasions, and he really understood the perverted world of the Gulag, etc. But what he says is, in the USSR, if 2 people are talking to one another, one of them runs to report the conversation to the KGB. And I think, and it's in many ways it's very true. It's hardly an exaggeration, And so for these people to get together, to establish Hebrew schools, to study together, to actually conduct seminars and symposia, to go out to protest. My gosh, they would go out to protest and they would know that they will be arrested within 2 or 3 minutes, because they always assumed that the KGB always knew everything about them, that they were listening to them. They even knew that there were informants among them. There were people like that. And so they knew who they were, So to be honest with you, I can't imagine that. I lived in that time. We were not refuseniks. We did not apply. We always wanted to emigrate, but we did not apply until 1988, I think, and then we left in 89. I can't imagine, and then the Smuckler chapter that you talk about, that you mentioned right now, the chapter about Smuckler and Jacobi, actually talks about just how daring, what a daring enterprise it was and how widespread it became ultimately. Alexander Smuggler essentially he came late into the movement. He was younger than many of the best well-known people. He joined in the 80s, and he ran the entire Samizdat effort, which probably reached tens of thousands of people, as he tells me this. And it's really incredible that people came together under those conditions. People at the heart of it came together. But then, and I want to make this point because I think it's really important, also as a mode of encouragement, is that one thing the Refusenik story shows is that it doesn't take a lot of activists to change the culture, the kind of activists like Natan Sharansky that are really, out there. Like, not everybody needs to have the kind of courage that Natan Sharansky has. Not everybody needs to be Shabbos Kestenbaum, who also gave up a lot, to as he fought, as he conducted his own struggle. But you don't have to be. Smuggler ran an organization in which there were activists at the heart of it. Around them, there were concentric circles of people who were involved at different levels. Some might take on risky tasks. Others might do something far less risky. They might just serve as a courier to deliver a stack of samizdat. Samizdat is self-publishing, underground publishing that, with prohibited literature. So they might just carry a backpack from the train station where it was delivered from Moscow, for example, to the local Hebrew teacher. Okay, it's a risky task, but it's less risky than going out and protesting in the heart of Moscow. So there are different ways to be part of this kind of a resistance movement, and I think there is a place for everyone.
Izabella, before we move on, in that very same chapter of Find Your Comrades in Arms, you brought up Leon Uris's Exodus. Share what it meant to the Refuseniks, because I didn't know that part of the story.
Oh, it's really incredible. I think a lot of people, for those people who don't, there are probably people in your audience who don't even know what the book Exodus is about.
They're too young, Izabella.
I know. Well, so this was
We're
a book
dating ourselves here.
Well, it's okay. I've already dated myself.
Okay.
I don't mind.
I haven't. Go ahead.
So this book, it came out, I think, in the 50s, or maybe I think in the 50s, and it became a massive
And then it was a movie, and there was a movie, of course.
And then it was a movie with the impossibly handsome Paul Newman, and it's a book that essentially narrates a story of the founding of the State of Israel. And Paul Newman in the movie is this really handsome pioneer who fights for, I guess he's part of the Haganah, I think. So he fights for the State of Israel. So it was a big hit, I think, in the West. Sure. But for Soviet Jews, they translated it and disseminated it underground without any permissions. Somebody would just bring the book and they would, translate and disseminate it. And it was something completely transformative for a lot of people. And when you ask them why, I think it helped them visualize what it was like to be part of the founding of the State of Israel. It's also important to remember that in the USSR, you didn't have a whole lot of this kind of literature that's meant to really hit your senses, like engage you in the way in which American bestsellers are written. So it was very, very powerful for people. And it was really identity forming. It really turned a lot of Soviet Jews, at least the Refuseniks, into Zionists.
Right. All right. So as part of the Be a Refusenik, a Jewish student survival guide, one chapter, as we said, Reclaim Your Zionism. Another chapter, we're skipping around here, is Find Your Comrades in Arms. The other chapter is Educate Yourself and Others. And we should say that the young person, the person of today that you featured up here, is Noah Shufutinsky, whom we had here on the program. We should also say that in another chapter, you had another previous guest, Shabbos Kestenbaum, who's paired up with Natan Sharansky. We'll talk about that in a sec. And of course, the one and only Marina Furman, who is such a ray of light and sunshine, and just a fighter beyond anyone's wildest dreams could ever be a fighter. And so we'll get to her, and we'll also get to Shabbos in just a moment. But do share with us the educate yourself and others. And you have here, in terms of back then, the 18 Georgian Jews and then Yosef Begun. So
Yes.
what should young folks and anyone listening right now know about educating yourself and others, and really that importance, Izabella?
Well, this chapter is really about it's about shaping and strengthening your Jewish identity in the classic sense in which we understand it. So I tell those stories because the Georgian Jews actually were an exception in many ways among the Soviet Jewry. I mean, first of all, they were not Ashkenaz, so that's already makes them different. But also, I tell their story because there's a very specific story of how they applied to emigrate and were prohibited and fought for it. It's a really incredible story. But what's interesting about them, and I interviewed them several years ago, those who were still alive, they grew up in a situation where their Jewish identity still could thrive in many ways, even though Georgia, of course, was communist, etc. But it was different. It was small. It was far away. It was a little bit freer. And so Jews actually were able to practice some of their Judaism. And at home, they still had the culture of observing Shabbat and talking about what Jerusalem means to them and talking about, next year in Jerusalem. So I remember one of them said to me, it wasn't just an empty phrase. We grew up with this next year in Jerusalem. It meant something to us. We had this internal gaze turned to Jerusalem. And so I use that story to make the point that they did not have to start from scratch. And then there is a story of another Refusenik, Yosef Begun, who really became known as a fighter for Jewish culture. And what's interesting about him, when he says culture in that context, he really means restoring, the wide, the full spectrum of what it means to be Jewish: religion, literature, history, languages. He called it culture. I think his example is really interesting because he said, look, we can fight for immigration, but not all Soviet Jews will emigrate. Some will stay. And those who will stay will need they need their identity strengthened. And he actually was proven to be right, because it was thanks to his efforts, in part, that when the USSR fell apart, a Jewish community actually got restarted in that sense in the USSR. So he really fought on behalf of Jewish culture. And his example shows that the KGB really viewed it as a threat. They viewed any kind of Jewish particularity as a threat. They really fought him, and they fought the Hebrew teachers. I talk about them, I think, also in this or a different chapter. So they really fought in many ways. They fought any shred of Jewish particularity. And it's really, I think it's a really important point to make. And this, I think that in the current moment, when I first came from the USSR, I would tell people, well, as Jews, we didn't know anything about what it means to be Jewish. And some of them would say, well, we don't know anything either. We didn't grow up with any Jewish culture, American Jews. And I didn't believe them. I didn't understand. I thought that they were exaggerating. But today I understand that actually it's true. I think there are a lot of American Jews who grew up with very little Judaism in their homes. And so I think that in this moment, what we are seeing, part of the problem that we're seeing is that we are failing to respond in many ways, and especially young people are failing to respond or ignore even. I would say we don't always have to fight anti-Zionist propaganda. Sometimes all we need to do is ignore it. But a lot of times we can't. A lot of people can't because they don't know enough to realize that this is all lies. And Soviet Jews, the Refuseniks, they didn't fight. They didn't try to debunk Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. They knew where it came from. They knew what it meant. They knew it was lies. They knew it was anti-Semitic. They felt like trying to debunk it is like trying to debunk the protocols of the elders of Zion. You could do it, but what's the point? And so I think that educating yourself today in the current moment and finding other people who can help you with that, and maybe then passing your knowledge to others, I think it's like taking vitamins to prevent to prevent disease. It's like, if I can, I don't know if I can use that metaphor, but it's like strengthening your system, strengthening your Jewish system, so that you don't become a victim of this anti-Zionist propaganda yourself.
Yet, Isabella, we find that there are many Jews that frankly don't care, that they've fallen into the trap of believing all of this. And no matter
Right.
what you tell them, and even if you say you're just spewing Soviet propaganda, they say, okay, maybe so, but it's still true. So talk about that. I mean, how do we then approach those people?
Well, I have sort of chosen this. I've been talking a lot about how I think, in this moment, we face tasks that are more in our control and tasks that are less in our control. I think it's a very difficult moment. And I think, in a way, we should perhaps be focusing on things that are under our control. If some Jews choose to believe what they choose, that the anti-Zionist propaganda is right, I don't know if it's up to us to, if we should be throwing or putting a lot of effort into convincing them otherwise. I think we should be strengthening and convincing those who are open to being convinced. I think we should be having a lot more conversations with people who want to hear us, as opposed to people who actually don't want to hear us. I always get questions about, how do I convince my left-wing friends? And I ask, why do you need to convince them? Go talk to people who are willing to hear you. So start focusing on educating the next generation of Jews who we still can educate. The ones who have already chosen not to be educated, I don't know. I don't think it's a task for you and me. I don't know what would it take to change their mind.
Yeah, I think the upsetting part, though, is that people that are on the other side of the fence, these anti-Zionists, these anti-Semites, use those people and say, well, they're Jewish, so
Yes.
therefore, dot, dot, dot.
Well, that is exactly true. And I talk about it in the book as well. In Soviet times, and honestly, I think it's an age-long story, probably, for as
Yeah.
long as there has been hostility to Jews. The anti-Jewish side used Jews as a weapon against other Jews. So in Soviet times, that existed as well. I give an example of uh, a press conference that took place in 1970, when the Soviets got together, really the best known Soviet artists and writers and this famous ballerina and comedian, and put them out on display and had them condemn Zionism and had them condemn Israel. And, it turned it into a big spectacle. It was
Mhm.
covered on the front pages of all the major newspapers. And, they said, well, look, we didn't stage it. All these leaders of the Jewish community, cultural leaders, came to us themselves and said that they want to express the opinion of all Soviet Jews. So that existed as well. And they were used especially, this was used especially when talking to the West, talking to the Western left about the situation of Soviet Jews. They would say, look, here are these, here's this writer, and here's this comedian, and here's this actress and ballerina, and they're Jewish, and they say that they condemn Zionism, and they don't plan to go anywhere, and that the life of Soviet Jews is just great, and that they don't need Israel. Of course, these people didn't represent anyone except themselves and maybe a very small portion of the population. But anyway, again, it was just staged by the KGB. So what I'm saying is that all of this has precedent. And how do you deal with it? So one way is to say, okay, well, so they're Jewish and they say this, and I'm Jewish and I say something else. So why do you choose to believe them? Here's a lot of other Jews who believe differently. So again, you can only convince some people that way, but we should be focusing much more on people we can still convince, as opposed to those that we can't.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. All right. So again, reclaim your Zionism, educate yourself and others, find your comrades in arms. Chapter 4 of chapter 6 is Do the Unexpected. You featured up the Leningrad hijackers as well as Adela Kohab. And what would you like our dear listeners and viewers to know about that chapter and really the importance of doing the unexpected. I used to work in advertising for many years for Young and Rubicam, and the motto was always resist the usual. And so when I read that
Oh.
chapter, I thought of the old mantra of resist the usual.
Oh, I like that. Resist the
Yeah.
usual. That's very good. Well, so the story of Adela Kohab, I mean, so the Leningrad hijackers, of course, that's it's an
A
incredible
fascinating
story.
story. Have they ever made a movie out of that?
So there really needs to be a Hollywood movie about
Yeah.
it. So there is a great documentary made by the daughter of two of the Refuseniks that were the leaders among the leaders of that group, Silva Zalmanson and Eduard Kuznetsov. So their daughter Anat Zalmanson Kuznetsov made a film called Operation Wedding, and I highly, highly recommend it. It's really excellent. In many ways, it's a personal look. That she tells a story as a daughter of these two Refuseniks, but there are excellent interviews there. It's really fast paced. It's wonderful. But yeah, I think that it really needs to be a Hollywood thriller because that's how
And
it
share
feels.
briefly what it was, as well as Adela's connection, if you will, to put together in that chapter.
Yeah. So the story of Leningrad hijackers is probably the most kind of daring attempt or daring act by by the Refuseniks, by Refusenik activists. So it takes place in 1970 when a group of young Jews, and they're really young. This is what's really important to understand. I think it's one of the reasons I emphasize it, and is that I think sometimes for those who know who Refuseniks were, sometimes they think about them as fully mature, grown up, and aging people. But at the time of their activity, many of them were 17, 18, 20, 22. So they apply to emigrate,
Mhm.
and they're refused, and they're really frustrated because they feel like they don't belong where they are. So some of them are in Leningrad and some of them are in Riga. And these were really important centers of the Jewish national renewal in the USSR, both Leningrad and Riga even more so culturally for sure. And so then an idea is born to hijack an airplane and fly it to the West. And it's born because an ex-pilot, a Jewish pilot, Dimshitz, joins one of these underground circles in Leningrad. I think he wants to learn Hebrew. And so he starts talking to other people and they realize, wow, we now have a former pilot, a military pilot, no less, I think. And he, by the way, one of the reasons that he wants to leave is he realizes, speaking of the discrimination, is that he hits a ceiling. There's a very clear ceiling in terms of where he can be promoted as a Jew in that industry. And so this plan is born. It goes through different iterations, and ultimately they settle on a plan to hijack a small airplane, I think 12-seater or 14, 16-seater maybe, from a small airfield near Leningrad. They plan it so that they occupy all the seats, they buy up all the tickets, and they think, okay, well, we're going to fly to Sweden. We're going to land there. We'll give a press conference there. We'll explain that we are Soviet Jews who've been prevented from, exercising our national rights, etc., and from emigrating to Israel. And then from there, and it's like it's endearing and it's cute, and also it's very tragic when they say, I think Yosef Mendelevich, one of them, tells me that we figured that we'll probably get arrested because we cross an airspace of a sovereign country illegally. We'll probably get arrested. So maybe we'll spend, 2, 3, 4 years in prison in Sweden, which is probably better than the Gulag. And then we'll go to Israel. So this is like, they're like, okay, we'll spend 4 or 5 years in prison, then we'll go to Israel. But they're captured, before they even board the plane. The KGB probably knew about their plan from the very beginning. And they are put through a trial that becomes a real turning point also for the Soviet Jewry movement in the West. This is when I think the movement for Soviet Jewry really comes of age. The pressure on the Soviets is massive. It delivers a huge blow to their image. So much so that they're actually forced to commute sentences. Two of the hijackers were given life, no, what is it called? What, that they were death sentences. They were going to be executed, and others got, up to 15 years in prison. So all of that gets commuted as a result of the massive protests in the West very quickly, within a week. And then, they still go to the Gulag. Eventually, some of them are exchanged in some spy exchanges a few years later. But it also opens the door. Soviet Jews start to get permissions to emigrate. So this really opens kind of the first wave of mass movement of Jews out of the USSR. Okay, so that's that story. Now, you could say, well, how does that at all connect to the story of a college student at NYU, Adela Kohav? And again, the point, I'm not saying that we should be hijacking airplanes. I want to make it very clear. It's not my point. What I'm saying is that just to be daring, to feel empowered to be daring. And I think Adela's story is very interesting here because she comes to NYU, and this is even before October 7th. And I think it's important to emphasize that Jewish students began facing this kind of anti-Zionist hatred on American campuses long before October 7th. I have two stories that precede October 7th. One is Adela and one is Noah Shufutinsky. And I include them again because I think these students, there were students who were crying for help or trying to point out what was going on, and nobody really was there to help them. Nobody really was there to hear them. I think the Jewish community really ignored them to a considerable degree. But Adela comes to NYU, I think it's 2017, 2018, something like that. And she doesn't even really want to be involved in anything Jewish. She wants to be in the city. She dreamt about NYU her whole life. She comes from a Syrian, actually very complex, very interesting background, but Syrian and Mexican, I think. So, and she, she's well integrated into her Jewish community. She says, I don't want to do it when I'm in school. In school, I'm going to be doing other things. And she starts doing other things. She starts out really not being heavily involved, but she gets involved when she encounters some of that hate, and she realizes that she can't turn away. The metaphor often used for a lot of these students is that I think for all of them, I think it's true for all of them, that they come to campuses really not planning to fight anything at all. They have their own interests. They have their majors to pursue. They're planning their careers. And then at some point, they encounter a burning bush. And that burning bush is this crazy, insane, anti-Israel hatred, which affects all of the Jewish population on that campus, and they can't turn away. It's like they are given a mission and they can refuse, but they don't. And so Adela, this is what happens to her. And toward the end of her student life, she goes through some really difficult experiences, and then toward the end of her time at NYU, she decides that she has no choice but to sue the university. And again, this is one of the early suits. She's done everything. She's tried to speak to everybody in the administration. At some point, she realizes, wow, they are just, they are stonewalling. They're essentially lying to me. They're saying that they will do something. They're doing nothing. And then like within a month, I think, a month before her graduation, she takes that radical step of suing the university. Remember, it's a university that she's dreamt about her whole life. This is, again, it's the point that if you told her at the beginning when she became a freshman that this dream of being an NYU student would end up with her suing her university, I'm sure she would have said impossible. But this is what she figures out, that it's the only thing she can do to attract attention to what's going on. In that sense, it's like she really does the unexpected, and she wins. And she today she's a very promising young lawyer who works on a lot of the cases that we see today that are filed by Jews, not only Jewish students, but also Jewish professionals.
Yeah, Izabella, when Douglas Murray spoke at the JNF conference just a couple months ago, and he said, students, and it was in Florida, Hollywood, Florida, he said, students that are going to college they shouldn't have to fight anti-Semitism. They should
Right.
be studying. They should be developing their interests. They should be having fun with their friends. They should be college
Right.
students rather than having to take on this huge, huge responsibility.
Right.
Yeah, this is the world that we're living in. Correct me if I'm wrong. Just before we move on, you pointed that that she was experiencing anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism prior to October 7th. Noah did as well. If I remember correctly, though, A.L. Jacobi, though, also experienced it at Penn when they had that Palestinian Writers Conference. And this was pre-October 7th. And there were people that were really, really very anti-Semitic that were being featured. And then moving on to the next chapter, Alyssa Bernstein at Occidental College also experienced it before October 7th as well.
Right.
So let's talk about that one. That chapter is chapter 5, Reject Victimhood, Alyssa Bernstein, and our favorite superstar, Marina Furman.
Right.
Right.
Well, so Marina, first of all, let's say that Marina Furman works for the JNF.
Yes, Marina Furman works for Jewish National Fund.
Right.
And that's one of the many reasons why we love her. But even if she didn't work, we would still love her for her energy,
yes,
for her story, and really for her inspiration. She and her husband, Lev, yeah.
Yes. Yes, her incredible courage and defiance. And the reason I want to point out that she works for the JNF is that, I think if for a lot of people, the idea of Refuseniks sounds like, well, these are people who lived a long time ago. Mm-hmm. We don't know. It's like these mythical people who are no longer with us, but they're very much with us. Like Marina is in America. Alexandra Smuckler is in America. They're involved. They work for known organizations. Marina, in this case, for the JNF. They can be invited. They can be speakers,
and they've done something with their lives. That's what's so fantastic, is that they didn't just leave here and then left it all behind. They really did something.
That's exactly right. And so, that chapter, Rejecting Victimhood, I think is very, very important. I think in some ways, the American Jewish community, in some ways, I think has really taken on the story of Jewish victimhood. Perhaps here's the thing. I think when people tell their collective story, right, the story of how they see themselves as a people, I think you always can find two themes. There's always a story of victimhood, and there's always a story of heroism. So we were under attack and we overcame, and here's our heroes, etc. I think in the American Jewish story, victimhood far outweighs heroism in my sense. When I talk to people a lot of times in lectures, especially young people, I will ask, well, who are your Jewish heroes? Like, who are the Jewish heroes that you know? And it always creates a pause. And a lot of times people will say, well, the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and they will say the Maccabees. And a lot of times this is where it ends. In Israel, Israelis, of course, have no problem naming heroes of their own, but for some reason, those heroes, somehow those names haven't become absorbed into the story. It's, I think it's complex why it didn't happen, but they didn't get absorbed into the story of American, that American Jews tell themselves and about themselves. And so this is where that point that I made earlier is really, I think, important, that the Refuseniks, yes, they were the victims of the system. There's no question about it. The system really did a number on them, but they refused to view themselves as victims, including Marina. Marina's story is so harrowing. She is a tiny woman. She, if you look at her, you would never think, well, how could she possibly defeat the KGB? But she stood up to so much horrible harassment and horrible treatment.
Izabella, she's what we call a badass.
Yes, she is. She really, really is. I mean, she's incredible.
Yeah.
And I think that defiance is something I want us to be borrowing from today. American Jews, I want us to be focusing a bit on how can we become more defiant. And Marina was that for sure. And then I paired that with the story of Alyssa Bernstein, who also chose Defiance, and she was on a campus at Occidental where she very much found herself in a minority in terms of wanting to resist the anti-Zionist kind of incidents that were happening there. And and she herself tells me, she says, we can't talk about our story as if it all consists of the Holocaust. There is so much more to our story. We have to feel like we are, I think I'm paraphrasing, but she said something like, we have to feel like we're not victims in our own history, but we're the protagonists in our history. And it was certainly true for the Refuseniks. They were the heroes of their own story. It didn't matter what the state thought of them, for themselves internally. They were the heroes who were making choices, that were leading the struggle, even when they were in the Gulag, even when they were, on hunger strikes, some of which were really severe and brought some of them nearly to death. And some of them would find themselves in prison cells with criminals, not find themselves. This would be done intentionally. Criminals would be put in the same prison cells as them and attack them. And, there's these horrible stories that I actually mentioned in the book. I don't want to repeat them now. But they just refused to think of themselves as victims.
Yeah. It's the importance of what I got out of that chapter, the importance of defiance, the importance of fighting back, and the importance of not being a victim, that we Jews should not look at ourselves really as victims. And that was the importance of that chapter. And that's why it's called Reject Victimhood. All right. And before we get to the final chapter, Lead with Jewish, Natan Sharansky and Shabbos Kestenbaum. Again, we had Shabbos just a few episodes ago, not too long ago here on the program. One thing I wanted to ask you to explain, you talk about it at the very beginning of the book, Izabella, is when we write anti-Semitism and when we write anti-Zionism, you've taken out the hyphen. Can you explain that?
Sure. So this is now becoming popularized quite a bit. But when I was writing it, it was still fairly new. But it started a few years ago with two British scholars, David Seymour and David Hirsch, who first argued that the anti-Zionism that we encounter today doesn't really argue against real Zionism as we know it. As you said at the beginning, Zionism is a Jewish national movement for Jewish sovereignty in the state of Israel. Today, some people would understand it as it's essentially, to be a Zionist is to affirm the right of the state of Israel to exist. It's very simple. But what the other side comes at us with is, it says Zionism is racism, Nazism, fascism, apartheid, settler colonialism, and every other ill that there is under the sun. And this is, so if we say anti-Zionism we use a hyphen, it's misleading in the same way as when the spelling of anti-Semitism, the accepted spelling of anti-Semitism used to be anti-Semitism. And gradually various scholars argued that we should drop the hyphen because the anti-Semites, first of all, what is Semitism? There is no such thing as Semitism. But also, again, it's misleading. It presents anti-Semites as actually fighting something that perhaps is rational, whereas it isn't. They have a fantasy of what a Jew means. And in that sense, they are living in their own bubble of conspiracy theory. So they're not fighting what Jews actually are. They're fighting a fantasy of a Jew, of an all-powerful and subhuman Jew simultaneously, right? Subhuman and super powerful. So it's the same with anti-Zionism. I choose the no hyphen spelling because I think that the idea that Hirsch and Seymour proposed years ago is actually correct, that the anti-Zionists live in their own conspiracy theory bubble, which is impermeable. They're not open to arguments. They're not open to being corrected on facts. If you come at them and try to explain things, they just sort of incorporate it into their bubble and say, well, see, this only proves that, if Israel comes under attack, they say it was a false flag operation, right? If Jewish women were raped, they find a way to deny it. So that's why I choose that spelling.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that. So, final chapter, Lead with Jewish, Natan Sharansky and Shabbos Kestenbaum. You paired both of them up. But before I want you to weigh in on why you match those two gentlemen, I want to highlight the fact that Natan Sharansky really sounded the alarm bell back in 2003 with an essay that he wrote. And I want you to highlight that.
Yes. So Sharansky understood the danger of what was happening on campuses already, yes, more than 20 years ago. So back then, he traveled to American campuses and he came back and he was I believe he was a politician at the time in a high level position in Israel. And he saw kind of the early stages of the birth of these centers of Middle East studies and the early stages of the Students of Justice for Justice in Palestine and the early years of the anti-Zionist rhetoric. He immediately identified it as extremely dangerous. And he came back and wrote a piece that was titled something like Notes from the Occupied Territory. And by occupied territory, he meant American campuses. And he warned that the real threat is coming to American Jews from the campuses of these universities. And lo and behold, 20 years later, this is where we are.
Yeah. And as he pointed out, and I think you did as well, is those students that were part of that movement and that they were studying then, right? Now, where are they? They're the professors.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So just saying. Okay. So you paired up Natan Sharansky and Shabbos Kestenbaum. First, talk about why Mr. Sharansky is such a seminal character for the Refusenik movement and why he remains so incredibly relevant today before you talk about the pairing of those two.
Yes, well, so gosh, wow. I mean, he's of course, he's such a giant figure. You know, in one of his books, he writes about how, you know, he's had different stages in his life. He was a Soviet Jew and a Refusenik, and then he became an Israeli politician. And, you know, today his life evolved into something else. But he says that throughout his whole life, what unites all of that, the common thread, is that he has been in dialogue with with the entirety of the Jewish people, and part of the dialogue between diaspora Jewry and Israel. So he has been both in the diaspora and inside of Israel, and he has seen this conversation from different points of view. And so this is partly what gives him, or I think it's a huge part of what gives him his wisdom and his perspective. And I think that today, he is really one of the very few consensus figures that we have as a Jewish people. I think pretty much everyone respects him for what he has withstood as a fighter on behalf of Soviet Jewry, but also on behalf of his own Jewish identity. And so, you know, why did he become the symbol of the movement? You know, there were others that were also symbols. I think he is more enduring because he has, you know, some of the Refuseniks who emigrated, that was, you know, then they retreated into their private lives. He remained in the public eye. He remained the public figure. But also, I mean, he was someone who really very much was in the public eye during his years as a Refusenik. And I think what he endured in the prison system and the Gulag was so harrowing. And then, of course, he was also, you know, there are some seminal moments that are associated with him. One of them is when he's released from the Gulag and he is exchanged. He's released via the Bridge of Spies in East Germany, essentially in East Berlin, in Potsdam. And that moment when he walks across that bridge is so iconic. It's so representative of the Cold War and what it meant. You know, President Reagan was really taken with him and his courage and his defiance. And I think all of that really elevated him to this stature of someone who represents courage, represents, the courage of one person who stands up against an abusive authoritarian system.
He's like our Nelson Mandela.
Yes,
Really,
exactly.
truly. All right.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Sharansky and Shabbos Kestenbaum, you paired them both up. And in just a couple of words, what do you want to share with our dear audience about these two gentlemen that you put together in the chapter Lead with Jewish?
So, yes. So, first of all, I think these two I'm trying to think, I think they're probably the only two in the book that have actually met each other.
Mhm.
They met
At the
each
King
other.
David, you said, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I love that sort of serendipity that happens when Shabbos drives up to King David, the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, in a cab. And the next passenger is waiting for his cab, and he rushes to it as he exits, and he realizes this is Sharansky. And they recognize each other because, and Shabbos is just completely blown away by the fact that Sharansky knows who he is. But of course, Shabbos by that point is, I think, a household name. And, and Natan is he follows, he's very much interested because he's very much interested with what's happening with young people. And so I'm not surprised at all that he knew who Shabbos was. But I paired them because of the inner journey that they take in terms of their Jewish identity. Shabbos, Natan's story is that he reawakens to his Jewish identity very much after the 6-Day War, and he talks about it in this really amazing way. He talks about it, that it was like falling in love, like discovering discovering Israel, discovering Israel's history, discovering the beauty of belonging to a people, the pride that he felt. It was like he suddenly had added colors to his life. And so from then on, he's really a symbol of fighting on behalf of Jewish identity. And a lot of the chapters about that. And Shabbos, in a way, has done the same, because Shabbos, he comes into the fight after October 7th as a registered Democrat. He's progressive. He voted for Bernie Sanders. He campaigned, or I think he campaigned for Bernie Sanders. I don't want to. I hope I didn't misspeak, but he's a progressive Democrat. And then, as he encounters what happens after October 7th, he undergoes this change, which is, it's a political change, but it's a change on behalf of his Jewish identity. He simply puts his Jewish identity on it, he gives it a priority. He looks around and he says, you know what, the party that I identify with, the party that I belong to, is not doing anything. It's not doing what I want it to do. And so he then he's invited to speak at these Republican events, and it's kind of bittersweet when he comes out on the podiums at those events, and he comes out and says, it must be the first time in the history of this, this association, this organization, or this conference, that a registered Democrat stands here in front of you and gives a talk. But this is, he becomes essentially an advocate on behalf of the Jewish identity and of leading, including in your political decisions, or your political choices and your voting choices, really putting your Jewish identity at the top. And I think both he and Sharansky make the point that is actually, it's not detrimental to your bigger political commitments, such as, your more general commitments as an American. Because the people who are against Israel and Zionism today are also anti-American. They're extremely illiberal. They want to destroy American liberal democracy and American society, American free society as we know it. And, you see him and a lot of other activists that I describe in the book go into demonstrations and rallies with both an Israeli and an American flag. Because they see these two going together. And so that was a connecting thread for me.
Right. Well, let's just reiterate: reclaim your Zionism, educate yourself and others, find your comrades in arms, do the unexpected, reject victimhood, and then finally lead with Jewish. These are all points in the book, Be a Refusenik, a Jewish Student Survival Guide. So these are points that students should keep in mind as they move forward. Do you have a message then for parents and also a message for university administrators, Izabella?
Look, for parents, I think that parents also should take some of these messages too. If you're parents of younger children, uh, really start bringing more more understanding and more involvement and more practice of whatever that means to you into your home, because it's just so crucial for identity formation. And start figuring out how can you strengthen your children's Jewish identity if it's important to you. Jewish Zionist identity. And really, when I say Zionist, I mean belonging to Jewish peoplehood. I think to the Jewish people. I think peoplehood is really a theme that we need to be focusing on in this moment, because all of the there's a massive war going on that's targeting us as Jews, and in particular our sense of belonging to the Jewish people, that are targeting our connection to Israel, that are targeting especially the younger generation. And so if you are a parent of children who you can still influence, I would say just start countering that. Not as necessarily like as in let's fight this, but just start thickening your children's Jewish identity and their sense of belonging. Because I think that one thing that's probably true of everyone that I describe, the younger people that I describe, American students, American activists, is that they come from homes that gave them a certain strong measure of identity and belonging. And I think that that's really important. And for
It's
the
not only important, I think, for their own Jewish identity, but I think it's important as an individual to have
yes,
a sense of identity to begin with.
100%,
Yeah.
100%. Again, I think you don't have to. I would never say that all Jewish students should be prepared to fight anti-Zionism on campuses. It's not for everyone. And actually, Adela Kohav says that not everybody is born to be an activist. Some people may want to be activists, some people may want to be advocates. But I would also say, again, looking at the example of Soviet Jews who, in one way or another, became activists in the Refusenik movement, you don't have to be somebody like Shabbos Kestenbaum. If all you can do is resist internally to the kind of onslaught that we're facing as a people and that you are facing on campuses, I think that that's already one small victory. So just arm your children with enough so that they don't suddenly begin to buy into the lies that the other side is selling. Because right now, this is what we have. I think we have young people, young Jewish people who just are not, who haven't gotten enough understanding of what it means to be part of the Jewish people and what it means to be a Jew.
Right. And then for university administrators, a
Uh,
message.
I think that university administrators really need to dedicate time to understanding anti-Zionism without a hyphen, and understanding how anti-Zionism creates anti-Semitic outcomes. Because right now, so many of them don't understand that link. And it's, one of the reasons actually to study Soviet Jewish history. And one of the reasons I wrote this book in stories, is that you really see how the language that's the anti-Zionist language, the language that condemns and libels and demonizes Zionism, creates anti-Semitic outcomes. When you see this story, when you've experienced what we experienced as Soviet Jews, and when look into this story, into this history, you understand you actually don't need abstract arguments. We get involved in, there's so many abstract arguments about, is anti-Zionism the same as anti-Semitism or not, blah, blah, blah. But here's a whole history of millions of people of millions of Jews who were discriminated against under a state that nominally considered itself, being against anti-Semitism, but was anti-Zionist. The Soviets would say all the time, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionist. So I think that the administrators certainly benefit from reading this book to understand Jewish experience under anti-Zionism. And they need to take it very, very seriously, because until they do, this problem will not go away.
All right. And on that note, we're going to leave it right there. Once again, the book is Be a Refusenik, a Jewish student survival guide. It's published by Wicked Sun Press. And I urge each of you in earshot and in viewing shot to pick up a copy wherever you like to buy your books. Izabella Tabarovsky, thank you for enlightening us with another fabulous conversation. I look forward to welcoming you a third time here on Israelcast. We want to congratulate you once again on the book, and we want to thank you truly for being so generous with your time on this episode of Israelcast.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I'd love to come back another time.
All right, absolutely, we'd love to have you. The red carpet is always rolled out for Izabella. Just saying.
I love that. I love that.
And we'll indeed have info about Izabella on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/Israelcast. And of course, we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. Simply search for Israelcast, that easy. And don't forget to rate and review us, because that really helps with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more folks around the world to find us and to hear from extraordinary people like Izabella. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/Israelcast. And indeed, it takes a whole moshav to put Israelcast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman and Stefan Oberman, as well as our trusty editor, Jay Rothman. The music that you hear at the top and tail of the program is, by the way, titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. Israelcast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, I know Izabella would love to hear from you, wouldn't you, Izabella?
Absolutely.
And so would I. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Once again, israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Stephen Shalowitz. Thanking you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of Israelcast.